competition, and it's, I don't know, like 40 or 50 categories. It's a lot. And yeah, so it's pretty exciting. Yeah.
So to get started, I'd like to ask you guys first what you know about lit mags, what your experience is, what do you think a lit mag is? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Yeah.
It's what I'm trying to get through is I'm not one of these people that wants to just jump right into things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to crawl.
Okay.
And so I'm trying to submit pieces here and there to various literary journals. I belong to Poets and Writers. And
Awesome.
They have a huge database of all kinds of literary journals. And I don't even know where to start. Like, I'll look at guidelines and I think, okay, this might be a good place for my work to land.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't work out.
Well, awesome. That's exactly what this is about today.
I know, that's why I'm here.
Yeah. So let me just say, you brought up a great point. So this is a great place to start as a writer. So if you're a novelist and you're like, I want to get my feet in the water before I try and send that work out to an agent, getting short stories placed in a literary magazine is a great way to start building that bio. So when you query an agent or you send out to an editor, they see, oh, this person has been published before. They know what they're doing. So absolutely. Yes.
I've never been really clear what literary writing is,
Okay.
nor what a literary magazine is. I understand a niche magazine like science fiction or horror, or mystery. But what's literary? What does that encompass? I don't understand that.
It's not really an easy thing to define. It's a certain style. I think it's one that there's genres that have certain conventions. So you mentioned about sci-fi, fantasy. They have certain structures to how a story goes and certain elements that need to be in the story. A literary story doesn't have those same elements. It just it's about more of the writing style. So they want to see the character development, the details. Does that make a little bit more sense? It's kind of a hard thing to place your finger on. I think today we're going to look through magazines, so you can start flipping through and looking at the work, and I think you'll see kind of the strings in that hard to articulate style that is literary writing. So does anybody have a definition for what a literary magazine is? Or are you guys also like, I'm not quite sure what this thing is?
Not sure.
Not sure, okay.
I just thought it was like a non-commercial. Like, for example, It's not like when you start out, sometimes you may go straight for the top magazines like Essence or New Yorker or Washingtonian or something like that. And they're more esoteric than that.
Yes.
They're more, you have those that may be a little bit easier to break through than others, depending on their circulation. A lot of these lit mags have a circulation of fewer than like 2,000. They're totally supported by your subscription, or paying for a single issue or whatnot. But it's more like the writing community supporting one another, like Ms. Eden says. It helps on your resume when you want to go for the larger fish, so to speak.
Yeah, so a literary magazine, unlike a large circulation magazine, they don't care as much about the sales, so they're not being told by their editors, well, we have to take certain pieces because they make money. So a literary magazine is going to have its own aesthetic, its own values that they can do because they have a small circulation. So it's really important to be able to find ones that do what you write. And because there's so many, you can find what does your writing. So I guess a literary magazine is also a place where people can start getting their writing out. They publish the little pieces of writers, so you can get, what's great about it is that you get the snippets of a bunch of different writers. So if you're looking for new reading, you can pick up one of these, especially if you know a name after looking today and you're like, I love this style. You can always go back there and find fresh voices. So it's kind of like an introductory manual to who's going to be the next great writers. They often have a certain theme that they embody, so they have I talked about certain aesthetic values, but sometimes it's just a literal theme. So Fourth River, they really like talking about environmental work. So if you write about the environment and you care about the environment in your writing, you could submit to Fourth River. There's ones like Rock and Sling that have a spiritual aspect. So I guess what I'm saying is they choose the aesthetics because they don't feel like it's being represented in the commercial. So they say, I don't feel like this is happening, so I'm gonna make a lit mag so it does happen. So thinking about, before jumping into this, what things you care about in your writing, what things you think aren't being represented, and having that standpoint, then when you're looking at these magazines, you can say, oh, I found one that feels the same thing I do. You have that connection. So why do lit mags matter? So like I said, they're a bio builder when you're trying to send out larger work. They're a great networking tool. So there's a lot of local magazines, which MWA is very aware of, but like Lil Patuxent Review, we have a good connection with them. So I submitted there, and I got to know the editor, Laura Siobhan, and now she's a tight friend of mine. So submitting to magazines, oddly enough, can create these friendships and relationships. They can also provide opportunities for readings and opportunities to get your word out there of what you're doing. A lot of the local ones will have readings where they have contributors come and do readings. So you're getting to start booking yourself and sharing your work. A lot of them also pay. So you might feel like being a writer, you don't get money, but recently I got accepted to Rattle and they pay $50 a poem. And so I say, people don't think poetry pays. Well, I just got some money for one. So that can definitely be an encouragement when you don't have a huge contract yet. Other reasons is that a lot of what's becoming a lot more common these days is that a lot of presses, small presses, will run a literary magazine. So it's a great way to get your foot in the door. Cobalt is a great example of this. So Cobalt is a literary magazine, and they say very bluntly that we get our submissions for manuscripts from the work that we love in our literary magazine. So submitting your strongest work to these might get your work in the eyes of somebody who can publish your book. So where do you find them? I brought today a bunch, so you'll get to start putting your hands in them, but you can also find them at a lot of libraries, at universities, sometimes public libraries, small bookstores. And if you have particular questions of wanting to try and find ones that fit what you do, feel free to hit me up. I'm going to have business cards and some of my contact information, and I'd love to give you some resources about finding a good home for your work. So going into that, there are thousands of these. You just mentioned poets and writers. They've got a database. You'll find a lot of lists online if you look for literary magazines, and there's thousands. And often on their submission page, they say, send your best work. We love every aesthetic, and we love good work that goes beyond every aesthetic. And you think, okay, that's really helpful. I don't know if I should submit my narrative memory poem or my really funky surreal poem. I have no idea. So the best way to answer that question of what a magazine wants is to be looking and reading the work. And they tell you that, and it's annoying because often they don't have sample work online, and it's a tool for them to try and get you to buy their magazine. So that's why I really feel strongly about letting you guys look at this work and getting to see what's in there. But before we do that, I want to kind of give you some tools for how to read a magazine. Because you can sometimes glance at the work and you go, okay, these all feel the same, they all feel kind of boring, I'm not really getting a connection. But as I've looked at thousands of literary magazines, I've started to learn that there are a lot of signs for what the editors value, what they're looking for, and a lot of it's overlooked. So I'm going to give you kind of the anatomy of a literary magazine. So the example that I'm going to do is poet lore, and I might jump between examples if they don't have everything I want. And if you have any questions or you want clarification on anything, just raise your hand and I'll be glad to answer those, okay? Awesome. So this is poet lore. So the first things that you see are the cover, you might see the binding. So they tell you to not judge a book by its cover. I'm going to tell you to absolutely judge books by their cover. You got thousands of these out there, you've got to start figuring out which ones interest you. And if you look at the cover and you think the art's boring or it's weird, that's a good first sign that maybe you're not going to fit with the work. Because the editors think very carefully about what the cover art's going to look like. They're obviously thinking about that this is a first impression. So it can give you some hints at what the editors value. So poet lore is a great example. Because if it's a little tiny here, but they always put this as their title. They say poet lore established 1889. So their history is a huge value to them. That they are one of the oldest lit mags in the country, if not the oldest. Actually, I think North American Review's a little older. So they've marketed this as a value, and to do that, for all their cover images, they always pick a historical image. So right away, you get the sense that history is something that they really value. They often also have, I don't quite know how to describe this, but a pretty narrative picture. There's usually a person there, there's usually a scene, it tells a story. Like I look at this girl and I wonder what's she thinking? What's the story of her situation? And this isn't always an indicator of the values and style of the magazine, but I've tended to notice if there's this kind of narrative picture that they value relatively narrative work and relatively graspable work. If you get a more funky cover, like the Attentional, it looks really weird. Well, guess what? Their work's really weird. And their artwork shows you that. Let's see another example. This is kind of not the best example, but Hawaii Review, they have kind of some surreal, abstract stuff, and their art's abstract. This isn't a 100% accurate rule, but something to think about. The other things I think about are the binding. So you see this is perfect bound. That's pretty professional. Poet Laureate isn't huge and having a lot of money, but they are funded. They're funded by the Writers Center in Bethesda. So they have kind of a support network. So when I see that, I say, okay, they have a history, they have somebody supporting them now. If I get published by them, they're probably not going to become defunct in the next year or two. With how much magazines become defunct, that's not a 100% rule, but I like thinking that my work will be able to last somewhere, and seeing the binding can, oddly enough, be a little bit of an indicator of that. But it also means that it's getting to a larger crowd, while the ones that are more craft, I don't know if I have any, okay, larger. Yeah, sometimes they'll be like staple bound or they'll be hand stitched. So there's kind of an artistic value there and a smaller circulation, but then it's also more intimate. So there's kind of pros and cons, if that makes sense. The last thing is often on the back they have the names of the contributors. When I'm at somewhere like AWP or a conference where I'm overwhelmed because there's hundreds of tables, what I do is I walk to the table, I'm like, does the cover art interest me? Do I know the name of the magazine? Do I know any names on the back? And that's kind of my indicator of if I'm going to open at all. So definitely if you encounter one of these, I would glance through the names and see, do I know any names? And the more that you look at magazines, you're going to start recognizing some names. And because Poet Laureate is local, I know some of these names from colleagues. So I looked at this and I was like, Elizabeth's in this. I know Elizabeth from the University of Maryland. And that makes me all the more excited to open it, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay, awesome. The other thing I forgot to mention is the title. The title is a huge indicator. A lot of them that are funded by universities, they're going to be called the university names. So it'll be like Indiana Review or Mississippi Review. So again, with funding, that's an indicator. If they've got a university backing them, that's pretty cool. If they have a funky name, then obviously there's more of a funky aesthetic. So like Hobo Pancakes, they're going to publish weird stuff. Dinosaur Bees, they're going to publish weird stuff. And they're probably going to be individually funded and pretty indie. So that title will give you something of what you value too. Do you want the academic background? Do you want the really funky indie thing? Something to think about. Okay, so you open the magazine. So you first get to the people who are doing the magazine. So like with looking at the names on the back, this is something I go to right away to see if I know any names. Again, because it's local, I know Jody, I know E. Ethelbert Miller, and I'm like, okay, I know something about what they've written, I know what they publish, I've met them in person, and so that's a really good thing to go into the magazine knowing when you're submitting, you know, what they write, what they've published. That gives you an idea of if your work's going to be a good fit for them or not. Some of these other people you might know too. I learned that one of the editorial assistants, Emily, is a student at University of Maryland who I've worked with. So that was really cool. So you want to take the moment to look at this and see if any names stick out. Next is the gem that I always ignored. Do not ignore it. It's the editor's page. So this is the best piece of information you can get. This is where the editor is literally saying, this is what I want. They'll often point out examples of specific work in this issue that reflects what they value, or maybe a theme that they tried to think about in this work. So this will give you a lot of information. It can also tell you if this is not something for you. So when I did this exercise, one woman picked up the Attentional, and she told me this isn't a fit for me. And she explained because she looked at the editor's list, and they said that the immediacy of our content is further explained by our deep and abiding love for subjects that especially affect 20-somethings. The woman was like in her 60s, so she's like, well, that's not for me. So that can be a quick eliminator for you to move on to the next magazine. And it's annoying because it feels like it takes time from getting to the magazine, but it's worth it. Next, you get to the contents. So kind of redundant from the back page, but scanning for the names. Also looking at the proportion of content. So Poet Laureate is not a great example because it's 100% poetry. So if you don't do poetry, this is not the magazine for you. However, Other magazines will show you a proportion of what kind of work they publish. So if I look at the Attentional, it's annoying because they don't have the categories, but I see that they have 1 fiction piece, they have 2 poetry pieces, 2 featured art, and then what looks like a couple articles. So if I'm a fiction writer submitting, I'm like, okay, each issue they're gonna publish 1 piece. So I'm fighting against everyone else for 1 slot. And so entering for your submission, that's an important thing to think about. So when you get your rejection letter, you don't go, oh man, that's horrible. You go, well, I was fighting against a lot, so it makes sense. And it makes you also think if it's worth the time to do that. Do you want to fight against 100, 200 people for 1 slot? So take a look at that and see if your genre is even represented. Nonfiction, especially if you do like creative nonfiction or something like that, seeing if they even have a category for it. Obviously, if they don't have a category, that's something to think about. And I say that, but it's something we don't always think about, and it annoys editors. At the same time, it's important to see what the guidelines say of what they're looking for, because creative nonfiction is an example of a genre that editors want, but they don't often get a lot of. So seeing what they value, what they're looking for versus what's actually getting published is something to think about. So you go through the table of contents, and then we get to the most obvious thing, the content. So I don't read just 1 poem or 2 poems. I read 3 to 5 at least. I don't make myself read an entire issue if I'm not interested, but I give myself several sample pieces, and I don't read just the beginning. I skim through, and I look at several different pieces, because 1 piece isn't going to represent the style. But I start asking myself some questions. I ask myself, am I engaged? Do I want to read the rest of the poem, or do I read like a stanza and go, I'm kind of bored? Also, I'm seeing, is this a place where I could feel like my poem is on a page here? Does it feel like it fits with the other work? Would it naturally go in next to these? And also, I guess, kind of, do I want to keep reading the issue after 3 to 5? Am I intrigued enough that I feel excited about this journal? Because when you're submitting and showing the excitedness is something that's important. If you're not really excited, you're like, oh, I guess I'll submit, why not? I think editors kind of get that. And it sounds funny, but I totally do that. I still do that. There's some journals where I go, I guess I'll submit. And now I have to really ask myself, why am I wasting my time if I'm not enthusiastic? The editors are doing this out of the love of literature. They're not doing it because they're making money. So sharing that common love is very, very important. So you get through the content, and then you get to the gold gem, my favorite part of LitMag, which is the contributor bios. This is the gold mine for if you're starting out and you're like, I don't know what LitMags are out there. This is the best part because it's where everybody who's been published by this magazine talks about where else they've been published. So if you look through this and you're like, I love poet lore, what else is like poet lore? You go through the contributors notes and you see what LitMags you see pop up. And often you'll see the same LitMag listed multiple times because there's kind of this network of certain LitMags that are similar to others. And so if Elizabeth publishes here, she's also going to probably publish in, I don't know, the Laurel Review or North American Review. And you'll start noticing these patterns. And the more you read literary magazines, you'll start feeling like you get a sense of what magazines are related in style, which ones are more in your camp, and which ones are kind of less in your camp. It's also great for seeing publishers because a lot of these people have chapbooks, a lot of them have books. And so what I do is when I have a LitMag, I take a pen and I go through and I look for the publishers and LitMags I've never heard of before, or maybe I heard of a while ago and I haven't submitted to. So then I've got this great list that after I'm done, I can go to my computer, plug in all the names, and I've got a list of maybe 20 magazines that I'm ready to submit to. So definitely, and that's why I think it's great to have these hard copy and have your own copy, because then you can write in it, you can circle things, and I'm very tactile, so to me that's very important. And then, I guess I don't usually mention this, but a lot of them have ads for other magazines. So that's another way to see a network of what magazines are kind of in cahoots with other magazines. So that's pretty much the structure. Does anybody have questions or comments?
What do you do about, do they become dated? Like, are you buying them like once a year and replenishing your supply, or what are you doing?
That's a great question, because I ran into that because I had a lot of magazines from AWP 2010, and it turned out I went to a lot of them and they're defunct. So a lot of my batch are contributors' copies. So when I get accepted, they'll send me copies, and then I bring them here so you guys can use them. I also went to AWP this year, so a lot of these are free copies I got there. But yes, it's very important to think about the year, so when you're picking one up, looking at how recent it is and seeing if that's still going to be relevant information. Great question.
What was AWP?
AWP is the Association of Writers and Publishers Conference, I think that's what it stands for. Yes, thank you. I always mess that up. So it's an amazing conference. They're going to do it again in DC in 2017. Mark your calendars. And it's pretty much the largest gathering of writers, of publishers, like small press publishers in the country. And so I was very blessed when going to the University of Maryland that it was in DC at that time. So I was able to just walk around and get a bunch of free lit mags. And that was the best education I could get for where to be submitting to. So I strongly recommend you guys, if you're interested in this, to attend there. Maybe go, I guess it's in Los Angeles in 2016, or here in DC in 2017, and just go through the book room, go to all the tables, and learn the names of what's there. Yeah.
I was wondering if you distinguish between the online magazines and print ones, or like the ones that have both, like, I don't know, what your thoughts are about that, if there's a distinction for you.
I think there's pros and cons to both. So a print has kind of the history of prestige. So when you're building a bio, especially if you're looking for like an academic bio, you want to have print publications. But online's so great because it's accessible. Like your friends aren't going to go buy Poet Lore probably. They're going to look online to the hyperlink. And so you're getting your work shared, and you get the Facebook like sends and the tweets and stuff like that. So I think that there's definitely pros and cons. But I do similar evaluation with the online ones. For me, I like to think about funding. So I look at the site, does it look crappy? Does it look well maintained? Do I like the site, or would I not feel like it's a good home for my work? Because in the end, it's a home for your work. So if I'm putting it on one that doesn't look like it's been updated since 2002, do I really feel proud to share that work, or do I kind of feel like, I guess it's something to put on my publication record? There's a lot of good international online magazines. Something I didn't mention is I'm a total proponent of international literary magazines. So from Australia, the UK, Canada, they often pay better. Plus you're getting networking with writers from other countries, which is too cool. But a lot of those international ones are online only. So yeah, does that answer kind of what you were thinking?
Yeah, I was just wondering kind of what your feel was for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you have interest in international ones, talk to me afterwards and I can give you some recommendations of good ones. Yeah, do you have a question?
Well, I was going to ask about that. I was going to ask, what about ownership rights with international journals? We kind of know where we stand in North America.
Yeah, that's a good question. Literary magazines, if they're professional, they're usually very clear about what rights are being taken for this. Usually in the US, it's North American first serial rights. So pretty much the expectation is that this is the first time it's going to be printed in North America. Once it's printed, the rights go back to you. In other countries, it's pretty much the same kind of thing, except it's just the international version of that. But they should be clearly delineating that, and if you're concerned or don't feel like that's clear, you can always talk to the editors. Yeah, does anybody else have questions?
So I realized one day you could spend an entire day just looking at literary journals. So how do you parse your time, or how do you figure out how much time you're going to look at literary journals, how much time you're going to write?
Yeah, I do them in different segments of my day. So what I've been doing recently is when I go to the pool, I bring a lit mag. So I swim around, I have it on the side, and when I feel tired from swimming, I'll sit in the pool and I'll look through it, and if I'm engaged, I'll keep reading, and if not, I just throw it back and keep swimming. So I go through a lit mag a day that way, and it's very quick and easy. And I often have a separate submission time where I'll sit down for like an hour in front of a TV show, and I'll just do my bombarding of submitting. And some of that is also exploration of journals, because you submit to one and then you find another, and it's kind of a repeating pattern. So I guess I'd just say set apart time, and maybe once a week, once a day to do that.
The submission process, is that all online now, or do you still have paper and snail mail that you have to use?
It's changed a lot. I started submitting in 08, 09, and my mom had to buy me stamps and envelopes. Now almost none of them do. Poet Lore is one of the few that refuses to go online. Gettysburg Review, there's a handful of others, but most of them are online now. Most of them use Submittable. Have you guys heard of Submittable?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's a great online format. When you go to a literary magazine's guideline page, they'll have a link for it and it'll open right up. Submittable is great because it's pretty much universal at this point, and it tracks all your submissions. So you submit to a variety of magazines on Submittable, and your homepage on Submittable will show where you sent, when you sent, what you sent, and if it's been accepted or rejected, or if it's still processing.
Is it secure? I've noticed a lot of contest submissions and other submissions don't give you that security. You're throwing your personal information on their page and you've just opened it to the world.
Well, I know of one literary magazine where their Submittable got hacked or something. I remember getting an email that they said that. Though honestly, I don't feel like I'm giving very personal information. I'm giving my name, my address, my email. And honestly, I use my university address. So if they hack it, they learned that I teach at the University of Maryland. So I recommend if you have a less personal home address or something like that, use that instead of your private residence. But that's the problem in the digital age, is that all the information is there.
What are what's the etiquette of submission? I imagine different magazines might have different preferences, but it's like when you submit to an agent, you know, or something, you know, if you submit a partial, you gotta wait a while before you submit a full, or if you submit a full, you gotta wait a while before you submit a full to someone else. If you wanna make multiple submissions of a piece, what's the usual etiquette you could encounter? Do literary magazines, I know I can imagine them not being too happy if they read through and judge the piece and then say, okay, we'll take it. Oh, sorry, you're too late.
Yeah.
It's already sent it out to someone else.
Yeah, so there's a policy of simultaneous submissions, and magazines are on different parties. So more and more are accepting simultaneous submissions. So you can send it to wherever you want, you just need to let them know that it's been sent out to multiple places and tell them as soon as possible that it's been accepted elsewhere.
Okay, you don't have to tell them who you've sent it to.
No.
Just that it's been sent out to.
Right, but keep an eye out because there are some that still say no simultaneous submissions, and I think it's ridiculous, but they do say that. And so you do need to respect that. I've gotten in a lot of trouble recently for not respecting that, and it's caused unnecessary drama in my life. So the moral is read the guidelines, follow the guidelines. They're usually wonderfully clear about what their expectations are when it comes to that practice. So I guess maybe we can take one more question. If there's any more, we can do it at Q&A afterwards, but yeah.
You mentioned Submittable. Is that just for small press publishers? Or?
Actually, a lot of large press publishers are using it as well. I've submitted to contests with the big names, and they use Submittable as well. It's becoming more and more of the typical format. Okay, and if you have any other questions, again, we can totally address them after the exercise. But right now, what I'd like to do is give you maybe 15, 20 minutes, and I want you to explore lit mags. So I've got a bunch of copies up here. I'd like you to look at least 2 or 3 during the time. Think about kind of some of the elements that I've discussed, and we're gonna come back together and just talk about our experiences, and largely like what lit mags would you submit to in the pile that you have, which one's not, and why. Does that make sense? Great, well feel free to come up and look through the lit mags then. You might have to share and borrow and exchange. Oh, you should.